welcome to the Parenting High Needs Children podcast. I am so excited to have you here. This is episode number 1, and today I'm going to be talking about what are high needs children. This is a topic that I get asked very frequently because this is a term that is not highly used. And I wanted to start out discussing this topic because I feel like there are a lot of parents that have high needs children. And this term resonates with a lot of people, and yet there are still a lot more people out there who don't know if this is them or if it isn't. And my purpose with serving parents of high needs children is to cover everyone, basically. My goal is to support parents of high needs children. And my purpose is not to specifically eliminate or categorize any group of children that may or may not qualify in this term. My definition of high needs children is any child who requires more time and energy from their primary caregiver or their caregivers than their peers. And this is a wide range of children. And this isn't just a typical child. I do get challenged quite often that any child requires more time and energy. They all require a lot of time and energy. And most people who can say that aren't truly challenged by a high needs child. A high needs child has more requirements, more medical requirements, emotional requirements, physical or behavioral requirements. They need more time and energy. They have appointments, they have therapies, they need doctor's visits. They are in constant need. They have 24/7 care. They have constant, continuous need for support that is beyond that of general children. And those parents caring for these kids need extra support as well. And in that, and as I'll discuss in a little while, these parents often find themselves with less support. And I, as a high needs parent, found myself in that very same boat and decided that this is not this is not acceptable. We should have what we need to support our children. And finding ourselves alone and isolated and not knowing where to turn, especially from those who are supposed to give us the answers, are supposed to help support us, are supposed to point us in the right direction. That is the hardest part of parenting, is not knowing where to turn, and then to be turned away by those who are supposed to help us, those who are supposed to guide us, and those who are supposed to be there for us to lean on. So I have decided that I'm not standing for that anymore. We are going to have extra support. We are going to have the things that we need so that we can provide the support and the things that our children need. It really starts with us and then trickles down. So, again, these children may or may not have diagnoses, and the diagnosis really isn't the important part in the grand scheme. It doesn't matter if the child does have a diagnosis. Some children are in the path to getting a diagnosis but struggling. Some parents are trying to seek help and getting the answers for their child and getting turned away, having a very rough time communicating the need for a diagnosis. And other parents don't necessarily want a diagnosis because they don't feel like that's an appropriate choice for their family. And in the grand scheme, they need to have the support for the child, whether or not there's a diagnosis involved or not. So it really doesn't matter what type of diagnosis there is. The point is, these children require more from their caregiver, and their caregiver needs more. To kind of lump that up, though, A lot of these children that I do see tend to have a lot of high needs and a lot of diagnoses even. A lot of them are neurodivergent. A lot of them will be autism, ADHD. They have sleep issues, sensory issues, feeding disorders, complex medical problems, physical delays, speech delays, learning disabilities, cognitive delays, motor or physical delays, a list of other medical problems. And this is by no means a comprehensive list. The list does go on, and the parents don't really have the resources that they need to kind of figure out all of these problems, but they're doing their best to kind of figure out which direction to turn and get the resources that they need for their children. But as the high needs parent, they're trying to find the therapy or which route would go best for their child, and sometimes that's not an easy route in itself. They need several appointments, increased safety needs. They have constant visual attention. Some of these children can't be left alone for safety reasons. And when I say left alone, I don't mean left unattended. I mean, some children can't be left to play on their own. Some children can't be left in a room while the parent goes into the next room. Some children can't go to the bathroom on their own. It's a matter of these children need eyes on them at all times. And other children need specialized treatments, specialized therapies. Some need special foods and diets. Some need specialized care where they have to get specialized caregivers to come in or people to train the parents on how to care for their child. There's a really big world involved in high needs parenting. And it's not just as simple as providing a diagnosis and going on your way. And I think a lot of people who don't understand what it's like to be a high needs parent don't get what's truly involved behind the scenes. And that's where I feel like it's necessary to be that advocate for not only for the children but for the parents as well, because we need to really voice what is necessary for us as the parent and what is necessary for the children as well. But it's really time that the world understands that we aren't just having children who seem different or are looking different or and some of them don't even look different, and that's another big stereotype that I'll touch on at another time. It's really an issue with the judgment that comes with having a high needs child because people look at us differently when our children don't act the way that people believe that they should. And it's really a challenge for parents because people are judging and making things very hard for general day to day practices. You know, you feel judged for going to the grocery store, you feel judged for going out places. Sometimes to the extent where you stop going, you stop taking your child out, you stop doing things that you enjoy or don't enjoy. I mean, who likes going to the grocery store? But you know, when you can't take your child without there being a scene, you find it easier to not go at all. And that's hard for you, that's hard for them, and it's very challenging to live a life like that. But it's it's hard to navigate when it feels like everyone is judging you. A lot of people aren't sure at times whether or not their children's fall into this category of high needs children. And particularly in like toddlerhood and that early preschool age, where there's a lot of changes going on and there's a lot of behaviors happening, and whether or not this is typical of children, and you know, they all grow differently and they all change and they all develop differently, but some things happen and it's very different than the last one. Parent might be new to parenting and not sure whether that's, the way children actually develop. And then there's a whole lot of outside information coming in and generational stigma that occurs, especially in the younger years, that can kind of sway us and make us wonder if we're doing it right or whether the child is developing correctly. And that really kind of makes us wonder. And there are some red flags that we can look for that help us see whether or not our child does potentially have issues or whether or not they might be on the right track for development. And this is where developmental milestones become really important because we're looking for signs that they aren't developing in an appropriate manner. Not that they're hitting the milestones in comparison to other children, but it's to be sure that they're hitting the milestones the way that they should be. And when they don't hit the milestones, then we can intervene and help them progress in the way that they need to. But red flags can be hit or miss, especially with children with things like neurodivergence, because they're not all the same. Some children will have red flags, some will not have the same red flags, and some will have multiple red flags. And it is very variable. It can change based on the child, but there are some that are pretty evident in children as they grow that we may or may not see. Poor sleep early on is often a sign looking back of high needs. It's not always the case that a poor sleeper, an infant who's a poor sleeper, is going to be a high needs child, but generally, when the child has a rough time sleeping, that alone makes them a high needs child. But as they grow, they tend to have more needs as they develop. Poor nutrition and poor eating, despite the parents' efforts, can be a flag itself, and it can lead into other problems, not causing other problems, but be a symptom of another problem. Difficulty with communication. Children who don't speak or don't speak well can be a part of that as well. They have difficulty with social interactions. One of the big signs that people tend to look for in high needs children is eye contact, particularly with children with autism. And that is not a reliable indicator. Many children with autism will make eye contact. A lot of them may not hold eye contact, but they will make brief eye contact. Some autistic children don't have any issues at all with eye contact. So, holding on to whether or not they make eye contact as a sign is not a reliable source. Um, Whether children have difficulty controlling or expressing their emotions is a sign of high needs, and that can be variable in different types of high needs. Making abnormal gestures. A lot of times, this is called stimming and is common in neurodivergence, and it varies a multitude of types of stimming. A lot of times, we consider hand flapping or flicking of the fingers a type of stimming, but there's also types where children will be fidgety or dancing or toe walking or pacing or prancing in place, and that's a type of stimming, and it's a release of their energy. It's a way to self-soothe and get motivation and movement, to kind of control their body. Stimming is something that these children need to do to release energy and help them regulate their emotions and themselves. And this isn't something that should be stopped or restricted, as long as they aren't doing anything to injure themselves. And as I mentioned, toe walking is not an appropriate feature in a child after age 2, so that makes it a sign of a high need diagnosis after that age. Um, when children don't interact with other children, that's a sign of social and emotional restrictions. Meltdowns, not tantrums, those are different. Um, Meltdowns can often be a sign of a high needs issue. Again, delayed milestones are signs that there is something underlying, especially when we have multiple delayed milestones. Some children have a delayed milestones and then catch up quickly, and then others will have multiples that stack, and that can become a more significant indication. Short attention or lack of attention is often seen with ADHD and common for other high needs types as well. Hyperactivity and impulsivity is often seen in ADHD as well. And there are a lot of children have an inability or low ability to consider their reactions before they respond and are very impulsive that way as well. Some high needs children will look to others before they respond emotionally. They will they may look at you after they have fallen to see if you respond and then have an emotional reaction or something of that nature. They may do things that don't appear to be as painful as one might think, and then have a what appears like dramatic response. Other times, they may do things that seem like they would be very painful and have no response. But when they don't immediately respond to the problem and then look to see if you're looking and then respond, that can often be a sign that they are having some type of high needs underlying issue. Early health problems, so early in infancy and in the first year when they have a lot of illness or a significant illness, this is a sign that they may develop inflammation in the body, and that can lead to different types of high needs diagnoses developing. A lot of these children complain of things being too bright, too loud, too itchy, too scratchy, too tight, too everything. And that's often a common sign with children who have varying sensory issues, which can be linked to multiple other high needs problems or be found alone in itself. A lot of these children might be obsessive with particular things. The obsessiveness may come as part of an underlying high needs diagnosis, it may come as its own. They may have obsessive actions, they may have obsessive items, they may be obsessive toward particular topics where they just hyper focus on those things and absorb everything they can about that particular thing, or it's the only thing that they'll use or play with or react to. These children are often restless and have trouble sleeping, unable to sit still, unable to relax, often overstimulated, often go into overload very quickly, just generally high strung a lot of the time. However, it is very important to note though that a lot of these symptoms can be present but present differently in girls than boys. And a lot of the symptoms that, or the red flags that we look for, have been determined based on studies done on boys and very limited studies done on girls. So when providers are looking for diagnoses, they're often doing that based on studies done on the symptoms of boys. And symptoms of boys and girls present differently, and girls can react to their symptoms differently. So, in many cases, girls have a very strong ability to repress their symptoms, to cover their symptoms, and to withhold their symptoms, which we often call masking. So, as these girls particularly get older, they get very good at keeping everything in and holding it together, um, particularly in like school age or preschool age, even. So a lot of times we see these girls can go to school and they may even have a friend group or a couple of friends, and they aren't necessarily acting like an ADHD kid at school, as we would quote unquote see the stereotypical symptoms, or they do respond to people when they are spoken to, and um, they're not having what people often think as the common symptoms. Um, though, as I already said, that these symptoms aren't necessarily the quote unquote common, but these girls have re- the ability to repress those. But when they get home and they come home to their safe place and their caregiver, and they know they are okay to be themselves, they often take off that mask and they fall apart. And then this is when the emotions run extremely high and there are meltdowns and everything is too much and they're very emotional. And this might be when lights are too bright and sounds are too loud and all the textures are happening and they can't relax and they're overstimulated and they get overloaded and they're melting down and all of those kinds of things. And a lot of times these parents are like, you had all day at school and you were perfectly fine, and now you're acting like this every night, all week, and you don't know what's going on. And that's generally the case. Some boys will mask as well. It's not uncommon, but it is more common in girls. And this can be a real problem because a lot of the diagnosing that occurs is done in a two-way test per se. So when the children become age appropriate, which is another sore subject if you ask me, when the children become age appropriate, a sample, as a worksheet, I guess we'll call it, is given to the teacher, and a worksheet is given to the parents, and they each fill it out. And if the child doesn't act a specific way at school and they're acting that way at home, a lot of times the providers will be like, well, this is a behavioral problem because they don't do this at school. And it's not necessarily that it's a behavioral problem. It can very well be that they have an underlying high needs issue, but they don't act that way at school because they mask all their symptoms. And they do a very good job of keeping things together while they're doing their school day and having, getting through the day. But once they get home, they fall apart and they can't manage at home. And it's not because they're acting out or misbehaving or any of those kinds of things. It's because they finally made it to their safe place and they're taking off the mask and they're letting loose and they're seeking out their parent for support, but they're not really able to express the things that they're feeling inside. And then it's all so bottled up. It's like shaking a soda bottle and then letting the cap blow off. Like they just can't contain anymore, but they don't know how to let it out in an easy way. And that is really hard for children. It's really hard for adults. I mean, if you're real about it, like you people get really frustrated and they don't know how to ease into that kind of stuff, and there's no way that. So this is why it's really important for us to be aware of what these signs can look like and what this can mean for our children, because a lot of times if this is what is going on, we really need to advocate for our child, because we may find our providers don't necessarily give our children that what they need, And it's not because they're not doing their job, it's just that they're not seeing what we're seeing. And we have to remember that aside from school or daycare or things like that, if that's the case, we are spending 24/7 with our children, and our providers are not. So we need to make sure that we paint a very clear picture for them, and that we are letting them know everything that we're seeing and how it does affect our children, and that we're very clear on what their needs are. This has to be expressed very well, oftentimes, in order to get our children the things that they need. As that stands, that is high needs children. Now, parenting high needs children is a whole can of worms in itself. It's a very challenging place to be. It can be very hard. As a parent of a high needs child, parents often feel alone and isolated. There are many times when the parents find themselves separated or segregated from those who should be providing them the most support. Family and friends often tend to pull away, or the high needs parent may find themselves pulling away because their child acts differently. And parents may not know how to interact with people who don't understand their child. And at the same time, the friends and family who should be supporting us may not be supportive, or they don't know how to respond to the child. So they pull back and don't interact. We often find that the community that we're in is not exactly supportive either. Oftentimes, parents attend church or go to outings or any other community resource, and they find that they are not being well supported there either. And this is not all cases, this is variable as well. But it's oftentimes we see that this is happening because people don't know how to respond to these children. And there is still a generational stigma that these children aren't acting appropriately and are just not being parented properly. And that is not the case. We should not be expected to go around and divulge our child's health problems or concerns or diagnoses to everyone on the street. So we don't need to go around wearing t shirts that say our child is autistic. But at the same time, the community shouldn't be treating us like we're doing something wrong when our child can't people, frankly. There are many times where our children become overstimulated by crowds or, public events or walking in, the grocery store. Um, that doesn't make us bad parents, but it actually says more about the community creating judgment against us than it does about us and our child. And that's something we need to keep in mind. We're not doing the wrong thing, they're judging us. And that's where the poor problem comes in. So, as parents of high needs children, we often find ourselves feeling isolated and alone. We're very commonly feeling unheard and ignored. We're expressing our concerns to people we think should listen to us, our care providers, and we're not getting the answers that we feel like we need. We feel defeated. Every day we're trying to do what we feel is best for our children, best for ourselves, and some days it's all you can do to get through the day. Sometimes you just feel angry because this isn't what you expected. And you try to do your best, and some days it just doesn't feel like you got anything accomplished. You're overstimulated, and your child is overstimulated, and that makes you more overstimulated. And sometimes it just doesn't feel like anybody gets it, and there's not anything you can do. And it feels very, very hard. And sometimes that makes you feel angry that nobody's helping you. You're very edgy and you're constantly fighting to get help and get support. And it's like no one is listening. You're on the verge of burnout all the time. and still nobody wants to help. And then you have mom guilt because you feel like you need to be doing all the things perfectly and doing everything for everyone. And it's just a constant cycle of wash and repeat, right? You keep trying and you keep doing, and everything still gets dirty, and you just have to keep going and doing again. And it's just like you never get everything done. And God forbid you drop a ball, and then you just keep trying and you keep going, and you're just exhausted and frustrated and sad. And then you probably have a little person or several little people who want held and are touching and need something from you constantly. Mom, 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 mom. And, there's the flip of the coin for that as well, because maybe your little one is nonverbal and maybe they don't like touching and maybe they don't want to be held by you. And that's heartbreaking. But at the same time, like, it's like a no win, like you can't soothe them regardless of how hard you try. And it's like you can't get all the pieces together because when you get one end in, the other end falls out. And you're just trying to do everything you can and you're fearful that nothing is going right. And then this is where you need support the most because all of these feelings are real and all of them are valid and all of them can be justified, but they don't have to be present. You have the ability to overcome all of these issues and all of these problems and live as a happy mom of a high needs child. You don't have to feel the judgment or the mom guilt or the isolation or feeling alone or exhausted. Okay, well, the exhaustion's a little bit present, but we can reduce or eliminate a lot of these problems as high needs parents. But we have to know how and we have to know what to do to get there. And that's the important part of this process. We can't walk this path alone, but we can manage this path, and it does not have to be a rocky mountain cliff. We can get through this. And we need to know how to talk to our providers, how to get the answers that we need. And we have to know the keywords to use with them and the keywords to expect from them. That's what's really important. Our providers will often come at us with simple responses. They're too young. It's just a phase. This is normal. Normal is never an appropriate answer, ever. And a lot of times, that's just a simple way of trying to reassure you to make you feel better about what's going on. But it's also a simple way of telling you that your concerns are not being met, and that's not acceptable. So I am I am going out and telling the world that these responses are not acceptable and that parents like us and high needs parents need more support. We need connection, we need answers, and we need people to hear us. We need to be seen. And that is my purpose. That is my mission. And I would love if you would join me. I am looking for parents who have high needs children and want support and want to be a voice and want to advocate for themselves and their children and want the ability to know how to speak to people who aren't listening and want the ability to brush off all the nonsense that comes our way because frankly it's going to be everywhere and we don't need it. And until the world realizes that high needs children are everywhere and that they are amazing and that they are going to do fantastic things, we have to know how to handle all the other nonsense. So I'm so glad that you've joined me on the High Needs Parenting podcast. And I hope that you'll subscribe and like and continue to join me for more episodes, as well as meet me over on YouTube and the other places that I'm connecting with. And I will see you soon for another episode.